All right, we're just 3 weeks away from football in Tallahassee with the Seminoles defending three-time ACC champion. Of course, didn't quite complete the deal on the national level last season with a Rose Bowl loss to Oregon. Jameis Winston off to the NFL. We bring in Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC to help us break down the Florida State Seminoles. Mike, it's always a good discussion here. Let's talk about the quarterback situation that I thought was a fairly slam dunk situation with Everett Golson coming in against Sean Maguire, who only has one game of experience. So from that standpoint, it's a landslide in Golson's favor, but it looks like it's still a battle.
Yeah, it's definitely still a battle. Everett Golson came in as a transfer from Notre Dame last year, 29 touchdowns and 14 interceptions, and the real life game experience coming off of the national championship appearance a couple years back. As a true freshman, he missed a year, ended up playing at ND last year, had a 60% completion percentage, 3,400 yards passing, but had issues turning the ball over with those 14 interceptions. Came into the battle with Sean Maguire, Florida State. Obviously, Maguire was feeling like he was going to be the one to replace Jameis Winston as he moves on to the NFL, but Maguire sitting here right now looks like he could be the starter. He's taking first-team reps in practice currently as Golson gets more acclimated with the Florida State offense. But as you said, Maguire with only one game of starting experience under his belt in his first 2 years in Tallahassee. Limited role, 25 of 49 last year for 340 yards and a touchdown and 2 interceptions. Now, those completions and attempts came in that game against Clemson. So we'll have to see what happens here. Everett Golson obviously has more talent, you would say, than Sean Maguire from what we've seen. But with Maguire's grasp of the offense, it looks like he could be the guy here leading the starting job early on.
Okay, the brutality and the idiocy aside from the standpoint of Dalvin Cook, let's talk to the football side of things involving the former 5-star running back who ran for 1,000 yards, even though he didn't start the season as the top tailback. Very effective down the stretch, had huge games against Georgia Tech in winning the ACC Championship game MVP. And despite the loss to Oregon, 100-yard plus game in the Rose Bowl. But Dalvin Cook is in question. Set us up for the running back situation.
Yeah, well, Dalvin Cook, without a doubt, could be one of the top 2 running backs in the ACC, along with James Conner at Pittsburgh. But right now he's suspended indefinitely with the battery charge from the offseason. But like you said, rushed for 1,000 yards last year and 8 touchdowns as a true freshman. But his status is still in doubt. He's got a court hearing in a couple of weeks, so we're just going to have to see how that pans out. Mario Pender is the guy at running back who's likely to replace him if Dalvin Cook ends up not being able to play for the Seminoles anymore. Pender, in a limited role last year, had just over 200 yards rushing and 4 touchdowns, but he battled injuries for much of the season. But the staff at Florida State's very high on him, and he looks like he could be the guy starting at running back, along with some younger guys that are going to be in the fold, some recruits that they have coming in as true freshmen. But Mario Pender looks like he's going to be the guy if Dalvin Cook is indeed unable to play.
Yeah, you would expect at a place like Florida State that even the talent of a Dalvin Cook going down, that they would just have waves of running backs, but that's really not the case. They're relying, like you say, if they get a share carries, if Cook's not in play, then they're going to have to be some freshmen to step up. But Mario Pender seems to be the guy at this point. The guy last season and in previous seasons at wide receiver was, of course, Rashad Green, one of the more prolific wide receivers in the history of Florida State football. Mr. Reliable, a guy that Jameis Winston is going to have to learn to live without in the NFL, but he was always looking for Rashad Green on third down. He's gone. Of course, the recruiting has been ridiculous at wide receiver as well. Set us up for what we've got at that position.
Well, wide receiver, you got to look at this as a second straight year that they've lost a big-time player. A couple of years back, they had Kelvin Benjamin, who had a big year en route to the national championship. But losing Rashad Green, he was a record setter at Florida State, and now they're looking at their receiver position with Travis Rudolph and Erman Lane, 2 talented young guys. They combined for 51 catches for over 800 yards last year and 5 touchdowns between the 2 of them. And they're going to have to step up this year because they're also trying to replace Nick O'Leary, who was a prolific tight end for them over the last couple seasons and the award winner, an award-winning tight end. Bobo Wilson will also factor in. He's struggled with drops over the last couple of years, and he's been hidden a bit due to the fact that they had such great depth at receiver, but he's going to have to play a bigger role and battle those inconsistencies and hopefully play a little bit better for them at receiver.
Again, there's never any question about talent, and they bring in a top 5 recruiting class every year, but the defense certainly was not what it was in the national championship season of 2013. It's arguably defensive back U there in Tallahassee, and they certainly have some great ones led by Mr. Jalen Ramsey.
Yeah, Jalen Ramsey is the definition of shutdown corner. And if you look at the ACC and definitely across the country, he and Kendall Fuller 1 and 1A, however way you want to slice it. They are 2 of the best corners in the country. Both of them are likely to be top 10, top 15 picks in next year's NFL draft. But Ramsey's going to lead that secondary for Florida State. They also have Tyler Hunter and Nate Andrews back there in the secondary that are going to play a major role this year. They return a lot of starters on defense, but the 2 guys they're going to have to replace are defensive tackle Eddie Goldman as well as defensive end Mario Edwards, who are both off to the NFL. But Florida State's defense, definitely not as good as they were 2 years ago in the national championship run, but they aren't that bad either. And if they can just be, even half of what they were in that year, they'll still have a pretty good team this year.
So this team played a ton of close games. They were dominant 2 years ago. Last season, they matched their regular season record, but it was a much different look to each and every game. BC scared them to death. Notre Dame probably, if we could debate that final call, but Notre Dame basically threw the game-winning touchdown pass. Even the likes of NC State took them to the wire. On and on and on. Georgia Tech only lost by 2 points. This football team was one play away. Even Oklahoma State, that turned out to be a 6-loss team, took them to a 6-point game in the opener in Jerry's world. So this team could have lost 7-5, but you are what your record is, and they pulled the games out. One of the big reasons is they convert field goals almost like it's nothing. It's taken for granted that they're good from 3 inside any type of distance, Mike.
Yeah, Roberto Aguayo is the best kicker in the country, 27 of 30 last year. That's a ridiculous 90% completion rate on his field goals. He was 18 of 18 inside 40 yards. So he's about as automatic as you can get at the kicker position. And anytime you get into close games, it pays to have a guy who's really just not going to miss when he steps up to kick a field goal, especially in pressure situations, like you said.
All right, let's look at the schedule, because I'm accustomed to, as you are, seeing Florida State really rack up difficult and non-conference foes. In recent years, they've taken on Notre Dame, of course, last year, Oklahoma State. So in addition to the yearly rivalry with Florida, that's about as difficult as it gets in terms of scheduling. Now, those 2 teams didn't turn out to be quite as good as they have been in the past, but to play 3 heavyweights, non-conference in one schedule, Florida State doesn't back off from anyone. But this is a bit of a light touch. And again, the Gators are down. They could probably win 6 or 7 games this year, and that's the traditional finale. But before that, out of conference, Texas State, South Florida, very manageable, to be kind. At Chattanooga, the second to last game of the season, in a strange quirk of the schedule where you don't play in conference the last 2 games of the season. So the ACC is going to be wrapped up for Florida State side by then. I see, Mike, as the most difficult stretch here in mid-October, where they've got Miami at home, and the Canes, despite their struggles, probably the most talented team in the other division, then Louisville and at Georgia Tech. So that's a really difficult 3-game session there that's going to probably determine Florida State's ACC championship hopes.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you, and I think you can even take a look further down. They play at Clemson there November 7th, so they have 4 games in 5 weeks against some pretty tough ACC teams there. They smooth in a home game against Syracuse, smushed in there October 31st. That should be a pretty easy win for them at home. But looking at that schedule, definitely a home game against Miami, at home against Louisville, and at Georgia Tech on Saturday, October 24th. I think that will be their toughest game of the season, going to Atlanta to play them, because I think Clemson's going to be good this year, but they have a lot of questions on the defensive side of the ball, and that game could swing into Florida State's favor and could perhaps decide whether or not they win the Atlantic.
Okay, Mike McDaniel joining us from inside the ACC. They say that a team takes on the personality of its coach, and this team has pulled out win after win despite playing very close games. But I've got a hunch that a lot of that had to do with the quarterback as well. So this is an interesting season for Florida State, where the the deck isn't completely stacked in their favor. And Clemson, according to Vegas, is pretty much splitting the odds for an ACC championship at this point. Mike, thanks so much for the insight on this one.
Thanks, Mark.